Hello, my name's Robert Batchelor, and I'm a historian. And in the spirit of explaining what that is, one of the things we do as historians is we read a lot of these things. But the other thing, and I think the more important thing that we do, is we take a bunch of objects that have been sitting around for quite a while, and we pick one up, and we polish it off, and we say, if it'll stand up, maybe it won't stand up. Look at how amazingly green that is, right? Look at how interesting that is. And the big learning point I've gotten from TED today is that that's actually work. So a couple months ago, I also did something that most historians don't do. I filed my first patent. It is a patent for a new technology that involves, oops, I think I was actually supposed to get through here, that involves social networking and how to make social networks more secure. Now, these two things, the technology and the historical research, might seem to be very different kinds of activities, but I want to tell a story today about how they're related, how historical research can inspire innovation. Now, the easiest way of telling that story is to say, my wife encouraged me to write a patent, Sarah Gilbert. The more complex way of telling that story is that a few years ago, in October 2008, I was sitting doing work in this place, the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, and I was going through the basket of objects once owned by this man, John Seldon, and this particular basket of objects includes some of the rarest Hebrew, Arabic, Aztec even books in the world. And I was going through the list and I came across an entry for a Chinese map, this item, the Selden Map. Now this map in the 1650s had been part of John Seldon's museum on the Thames River in London. It had been the centerpiece of his collection, but it had been gathering dust for 300 years or so. And it's an interesting map. At the top you see the Ming Empire. You might be able to make out the Great Wall up there at top. But the map itself is centered on the South China Sea, and it shows China's relationship with Southeast Asia, as well as the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And what's different about this map is that most Ming maps from this period center on the Ming Empire itself, and that's led people who've seen them to say, well, you know, the Ming, it was kind of closed and inward-looking, and it also kind of reinforces those tourist cliches we know about China, the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, right? But this map showed China engaging with the world. And when we showed it to the head of special collections at Beijing's National Library, he said this is one of the most important Chinese maps I'd ever seen and been gathering dust for 300 years. Difficult to unroll. It's in a fragile state. We've been doing some restoration on it. But when we did unroll it, the most interesting thing that we saw, and this was quite amazing, was emanating from this port city of Guangzhou in Fujian province here were a series of lines. Now these lines were trade routes. And the trade routes have marked on them, you can see the little Chinese characters on them, the trade routes have marked on them directional bearings, and they actually are measured out in the length of ship watches. And this is extraordinary because even European maps from this period don't show the European trade routes, let alone the Chinese maps from this period. And so why is that? Well, what the map is the equivalent of a mass of trade secrets. That is, this was something that was owned by a Chinese merchant family. They would have closely guarded these secrets. They wouldn't have shared them with other merchants because this was the key to moving around this space and making money from it. Now, as we've been doing the restoration, something even more amazing came out, which was that on the back of that map, there was a line that stretched as an axis across that was the first draft of the routes. And this meant that that map was not per se a map, it was more like a diagram. It showed the routes were drawn first, and it showed the way in which a network worked. It was a mathematical algorithm, a mathematical story in that way. You could move around that space according to a set of movements. A little bit like the London Underground map, as opposed to kind of a regular kind of cartographic map. And this got me thinking about modern social networks. That is, what's missing from modern social networks? And the other thought I started to have as I started to think about that, and I came up with this patent about modern social networks, is what is it that causes that action at a distance? What is it about this map that could make me rethink modern social networks in the 21st century? And I came back to the map. I said, inside that map, there is embedded this mathematical story, this algorithm, right? And the power of that map, the power of the network depicted in that map, was its association with that mathematical story. And so the point I want to bring forward today about that is that stories allow networks to be recovered, translated, and passed on. This is what historians do. It's what the Greek Homeric poets did. It's what the writers of the Bible did. It's what Jonathan Rabb does. It's what Tom Kohler does, or Homer and Moses. What we do, and I'm going to put myself in that august company, what we do is we reactivate stories so that old, dusty, inert objects can once again change the world. Now, I want to introduce you to a tree. This particular tree was introduced to me by Eleanor Harrison, who's here in the audience today. It's about 6 miles from here, in the middle of the Savannah Wildlife Refuge, on a place called Five Plantation. And the reason why I want to introduce you to this tree is because this tree is a reminder to me of the problem of activating seemingly inert objects. That is, what if we don't know the story anymore, right? It's like this machine that's sitting there and we don't know how to make it work. I did a little work there, that's good. So this particular tree has grown big over the past 200 years because it knows how to find old networks. Underneath this tree is a 2,500-year-old Deptford-era Native American mound. That mound is filled with oyster shells. And this tree's roots have been tapping into the lime in those oyster shells, and this tree has grown really big. Now, those Deptford mounds were first found in the Savannah area. They're named after a little place to the east of town. They were first found in the Savannah area in the 1930s. And they're identifiable because in those Deptford mounds, you'll find this check pattern pottery, this little network pattern pottery, up and down what was 2,500 years ago the first version of the Creative Coast. Now, that pottery is made with a little punch tool. You kind of punch out your little holes in the network. Before the punch tool was developed, they actually used a piece of rope, and sometimes they'd use a piece of cloth to get that network pattern, right? And I'm not sure what that's about. You could think of it, well, this is a pottery imitating a basket, right? The weave of a basket. You could think of it as, well, this is maybe imitating nature, like a bird's nest or something, right? I have this theory. My theory is that this has to do with what those Deptford mound builders were doing in addition to piling up shells. And it's the same thing that the Algonquins were doing 1,500 years later when the English arrived in what's now North Carolina. That is, they were farming fish with lattice work traps and nets. Now, I can't be sure of that theory, and the people who first dug up the Deptford mounds in the 1930s, widows who were working for the WPA, when they were putting those pieces of pottery into their baskets, they didn't know what that network pattern meant. And when I took my students out to Five Plantation, and we carefully sort of marked where each one of those pieces of pottery were, and we photographed them, and we said, we tried to trace out where the tree was pushing these things up. They didn't know what that pottery meant. But what if that pottery holds a kind of clue, an idea to how we might have sustainable fishing, sustainable coastal management over the long term, over periods of thousands of years, right? Don't know, maybe. shouldn't we at least be teaching our children about it, right? Shouldn't they know about Deptford pottery? Shouldn't they know that people have been living here and working here for over 2,500 years, right? And so this is the kind of second point I want to bring across today, which is pay attention to the long now, even if you don't know the story yet, right? And that, it seems to me, is important for innovation because we don't know where innovation is going to come from. We don't know whether something is important or junk. We don't know whether the Selden Map or the Deptford pottery is going to bring about the new idea, the next patent, right? And this brings me to a problem. And I think the organizers put all the problems at the end of the day today, so we're ready to face the world. It's probably, I think, I'll just say that it's one of the most difficult, it may not be the biggest, but it's one of the most difficult problems our democracy faces. These barrels of nuclear waste. They are being dug up from the Hanford site in Washington State. Some of these barrels contain plutonium-239. Now, plutonium-239 is one of the most poisonous substances on the planet. It is also an essential ingredient in making nuclear weapons. And the other thing about plutonium-239 is it has this staggeringly long half-life. That is, it's active, half of it, around for active for 24,110 years. That's 10 times as long as that little piece of Deptford pottery we had up there, right? And plutonium will remain active, poisonous, and able to be converted into nuclear weapons for about 200,000 years. So they're moving this out of Washington State because they don't want this stuff leaking into the groundwater, which is a good idea, right? And they're moving it across the country to that little green spot on the satellite photo you see. It's called the Savannah River Site, right? Now, the Savannah River Site also has its own nuclear waste there, but it's become, over the past decade, the destination of choice for nuclear waste from Hanford, from Rocky Flats in Colorado, from Los Alamos in New Mexico, from Lawrence Livermore in California, and of course from Russia. Now, they have a very sophisticated network of processes and procedures at the Savannah River Site for handling that plutonium. Smart people working there, right? And it goes through all this stuff, and it's supposed to be vitrified and turned into glass, and eventually it's supposed to end up in a geological repository, right? That geological repository is supposed to be in Nevada, so you'd ship it back out to Nevada. There would be these salt mines, and it'd be safe for about 4,000 years, which, by the way, is not really long enough. But we haven't really organized that get the Nevadans to sort of accept that the geological repositories were there. So basically, this plutonium is piling up in a swamp next to a river. And that's not really even a good 30-year plan. Now, we may think that this is a challenge, let's say. And it's a challenge because we're not used to thinking in periods that are this long. And we may think that our newest social technologies might hold the answer. As one of the cartoons earlier today suggested, they might be causing revolutions in the Middle East. We might have the 10,000-year Twitter. We also might think that tool of networking par excellence, the one that opens all those doors, might hold the answer, and billions of this is being pumped in the Savannah River Site every year. But I would like to suggest a social networking tool that is very time-tested and very good. It was a social networking tool that was formed by one group and passed down by many. And I'd like to say that this social networking tool, which has helped establish the stability of the oldest system of popular sovereignty on the planet, is a good one. It makes me think that I would rather have this plutonium upriver for my kids in a swamp than, say, in Russia, where it might be in a warehouse and sold to the highest bidder. But there's something that comes with this, which is we need to be, and it's an opportunity, and I think we have an opportunity here to say to our kids that this is the way in which we want to talk about this. This is the way we want to solve this problem. And so that story would go something like this. Kids, there are lots of ways of forming a social network. Kings and states can impose them from above. Merchants can reach out and form networks. We, the people, believe in popular sovereignty. We believe in it so much that at one point in our history, we made something terrible. We made weapons that can destroy whole cities. But we also believe in it so much that we're going to tell you as citizens about the history, about the dangers, and about the responsibilities that come with nuclear material. Let me warn you, kids, these responsibilities stretch out over tens of thousands of years. This is more than any previous human civilization has ever had to think about. But it is the great challenge of our times, and if we figure this one out, global warming actually might be a lot easier to solve, right? If we figure out how to think historically over the long term. The founders of our country knew how to make networks and narratives, networks and stories for the long now, right? And so we need to take inspiration from them in creating networks that we can hand down. We need to look at the long history of the human past, whether that's Chinese maps or Native American pottery, to figure out what we can do to solve this. And then finally, we need to use our original social network, our original algorithm, our tool, to do what those people in that algorithm wrote, which was to ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Thank you very much for a great day.